Have you ever had to hide who you really are just to fit in somewhere? Drop your location in the comments because I love hearing from viewers all around the world, especially those who understand what it feels like to wear a mask every single day. The European embassy in Queens looked exactly like every other government building Lena Thorne had ever entered. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill, and that particular smell of industrial cleaning supplies mixed with human frustration. She adjusted her navy blazer and checked her watch as she joined the line of people clutching folders full of documents, all of them wearing the same expression of resigned determination that came with navigating international bureaucracy. At 28, Lena had perfected the art of blending in. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her makeup minimal but professional, her clothing chosen specifically to be unremarkable, business casual, forgettable, safe. She had learned the hard way that standing out was dangerous, that drawing attention meant questions she could never answer honestly. The waiting area buzzed with multilingual conversations and the rustle of paperwork. A family with 3 young children occupied the chairs near the window, their documents spread across 2 seats while the parents took turns entertaining the toddler who kept trying to escape toward the reception desk. An elderly man in a worn coat sat alone, methodically organizing and reorganizing the same stack of forms he had been holding when Lena arrived 20 minutes earlier. She found an empty chair along the wall and settled in to wait, automatically cataloging the room's layout the way she had been trained to do years ago. 2 exits, security camera in the northeast corner, panic button behind the reception desk. The habits died hard, even when she was just trying to renew her work visa like any other civilian. Lena pulled out her phone and pretended to scroll through emails while actually observing the people around her. The mother with the 3 children kept checking her watch nervously, obviously worried about missing some appointment. The elderly man had started talking to himself in what sounded like Italian, growing more agitated as he compared different versions of the same form. A woman in an expensive suit paced near the information desk, speaking rapid French into her phone with increasing frustration. This was her life now. Waiting rooms and paperwork, deadlines and bureaucracy. Normal problems for normal people. It was what she had wanted when she left her old life behind 18 months ago. But some days the mundane nature of civilian existence felt almost suffocating after years of high-stakes operations where every decision mattered and every moment carried weight. The security guard stationed near the main entrance caught her attention, not because he posed any threat, but because his positioning was inefficient. Victor something, according to his name tag. Mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, carrying himself with the kind of false authority that came from wearing a uniform but never actually being tested. He kept scanning the room like he expected trouble, but his gaze lingered on the wrong people and missed the obvious warning signs of genuine agitation from the man muttering in Italian. Lena forced herself to look away before Victor noticed her staring. The last thing she needed was to attract attention from embassy security, especially when she was here for legitimate reasons. Her work visa was expiring in 6 weeks, and while her employer had filed all the necessary paperwork for renewal, there had been some confusion about her previous employment history that required clarification in person. The confusion was entirely her own fault. When she had applied for the original visa, she had listed her most recent job as security consulting, without providing the kind of detailed background information that would have revealed her actual qualifications. Now the embassy wanted documentation of her security certifications and professional references, neither of which she could provide without exposing the military service record she had worked so hard to bury. Her current job managing database security for a small financial firm in Manhattan was legitimate, if mind-numbingly boring compared to her previous career. She was good at it. Good enough that her supervisor had been willing to sponsor her visa renewal without asking too many questions about the gaps in her resume. But the embassy officials were more thorough than her boss, and they wanted proof that she had the experience she claimed. Across the waiting room, a man in an expensive charcoal suit was conducting business with one of the embassy officials near the information desk. Lena noticed him because he carried himself with the same kind of controlled awareness she recognized in herself. That subtle alertness that came from surviving situations where complacency meant death. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and when he turned to scan the room briefly, She caught sight of sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog every person and exit with professional efficiency. He was older than her, probably mid-40s, and everything about him suggested wealth and authority. The suit was tailored perfectly, his shoes were Italian leather, and when he spoke to the embassy official, it was with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to getting results. But it was the way he moved that marked him as more than just another wealthy businessman dealing with international paperwork. Every gesture was economical, purposeful. He stood with his weight balanced, ready to move in any direction without telegraphing his intentions. Lena realized she was staring again and quickly returned her attention to her phone, but she remained aware of him in her peripheral vision. It had been months since she had encountered anyone who triggered her tactical instincts, anyone who made her wonder what kind of background had taught them to move like that. In her new civilian life, most people were exactly what they appeared to be. Accountants looked like accountants, lawyers looked like lawyers, and database administrators definitely looked like database administrators. This man looked like someone who understood violence. The thought should have been concerning, but instead Lena found herself almost relieved to encounter someone who might understand the world she had left behind. The isolation of civilian life had been harder to adjust to than she had anticipated. She was surrounded by people every day, but none of them spoke her language. None of them understood why she automatically positioned herself with her back to the wall, or why sudden loud noises made her reach for weapons that were no longer there. Number 47, the automated system announced, and Lena checked her ticket. Fortinine. Almost her turn. She gathered her documents and stood, moving toward the processing area where a tired-looking woman was reviewing the family's paperwork with obvious frustration. The mother kept apologizing in broken English while trying to prevent her toddler from grabbing the official stamps scattered across the desk. It was taking forever, and Lena could see Victor growing impatient as the line backed up behind the family. The man in the expensive suit had finished his business and was walking toward the exit, but he paused near the seating area to check his phone. From her new position near the processing desk, Lena had a better view of his profile. Definitely Italian. Probably native based on the way he had been speaking to the embassy official. There was something familiar about him that she could not quite place, like seeing someone in an unexpected context where they looked almost, but not quite like someone else. Number 48 was called, and the elderly man with the Italian forms shuffled forward, still muttering anxiously to himself. The embassy official tried to explain something about missing signatures, but the man's English was limited and his agitation was growing by the minute. Victor had started moving closer to the desk, obviously preparing to intervene if the situation escalated. The man in the suit was still standing near the chairs, and Lena realized he was listening to the elderly man's increasingly frustrated Italian. His expression had shifted subtly, from polite indifference to something that looked almost like concern. When the elderly man started gesturing wildly at his forms while the embassy official shook her head, the suited man stepped forward and addressed him in rapid, fluent Italian. Lena could not understand what he was saying, but his tone was calm and authoritative. The elderly man immediately focused on him, responding with obvious relief at finding someone who spoke his language. The suited man listened for a moment, then turned to the embassy official and explained the problem in perfect English. Missing translation of a death certificate, simple clerical error that could be resolved with a phone call to the appropriate office in Rome. Problem solved in less than 2 minutes. The elderly man was practically weeping with gratitude, and the embassy official looked relieved to have the situation handled without Victor's heavy-handed intervention. The man in the suit accepted the thanks with a slight nod, then continued toward the exit without making a big show of his good deed. Definitely not just a businessman, Lena decided. Someone with that kind of command presence and natural authority was accustomed to solving problems and managing people. Military, maybe, or law enforcement. Or something less legitimate, but equally demanding of leadership skills. The way Victor had immediately backed off when the man approached suggested he recognized authority when he saw it, even if he could not identify its source. Number 49 was called, and Lena stepped forward to the desk, her documents organized and ready. This should have been straightforward. Routine visa renewal, legitimate employment, clean record. But as she handed over her paperwork, she could see the embassy official's expression shift from professional courtesy to bureaucratic suspicion. We need additional documentation regarding your security consulting background, the woman said, scanning Lena's application. The employment verification from your current position is insufficient to establish your qualifications for the work visa category you originally applied under. Lena had been dreading this conversation. What kind of additional documentation do you need? Professional certifications, training records, references from previous security positions. The file shows significant gaps in your employment history that need to be explained before we can approve the renewal. This was the catch-22 that had kept Lena awake for weeks. She could not provide the documentation they wanted without revealing her military service record, which would raise questions she was not prepared to answer. But without that documentation, her visa renewal would be denied, and she would have to leave the country within 30 days. I can provide character references from my current employer and previous clients, Lena offered, knowing it would not be enough. That's not sufficient for someone claiming 5 years of experience in security consulting. We need verification of formal training and professional certification. If you cannot provide those documents, we will have to process your application under a different category, which may affect your eligibility. Victor had moved closer to the desk, obviously eavesdropping on the conversation. His expression suggested he was enjoying watching someone else struggle with embassy bureaucracy, and Lena could see him preparing to insert himself into the situation if she showed any signs of becoming argumentative. How long would that take? Lena asked, trying to keep her voice level despite the growing certainty that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to collapse around her. 4 to 6 weeks for reclassification, assuming your application is approved under the alternative category. If it's denied, you would need to leave the country and reapply from your home country, which could take several months. Lena felt her chest tighten with familiar stress that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with being trapped in a situation with no good options. 6 weeks might be manageable, but months of uncertainty while living in bureaucratic limbo was exactly the kind of unstable situation she had been trying to avoid by seeking civilian anonymity in the first place. I need to make some phone calls, she said, gathering her documents. Can I come back later today? You can make an appointment for next week, the embassy official replied, already reaching for the next person's paperwork. We're fully booked until then. Victor stepped forward with obvious satisfaction, clearly relishing the opportunity to assert his authority over someone who had been causing delays. Ma'am, you need to move away from the desk so we can help the next person, he said, his tone suggesting she was being unreasonably difficult. Lena looked at him steadily, recognizing the type immediately. Small-time authority figure who enjoyed exercising power over people who could not fight back. In her old life, she would have handled this very differently, but civilian life meant swallowing her pride and accepting bureaucratic humiliation as the price of staying under the radar. Of course, she said, stepping back from the desk. Thank you for your help. But Victor was not satisfied with her compliance. He had tasted a little bit of authority and wanted to exercise more of it, especially in front of an audience that included several other people struggling with their own paperwork problems. You need to understand that embassy time is valuable, he said, moving closer to her with obvious intimidation intent. Coming here without proper documentation wastes everyone's time. Lena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded violence, the same physiological response that had kept her alive through more dangerous situations than she could count. But this was not a combat zone. This was a government building full of innocent civilians, and Victor was just an overzealous security guard, not an enemy combatant. She forced herself to take a slow breath and maintain civilian posture. I understand, she said quietly, hoping he would accept her submission and let her leave peacefully. But Victor had an audience now, and he was determined to make the most of his moment of authority. Maybe next time you'll come prepared instead of wasting everyone's time, he said loudly enough for the other applicants to hear. Lena could feel every person in the waiting area watching the interaction, some with sympathy, others with the morbid curiosity that came from watching someone else's humiliation. The familiar heat of anger rose in her chest, but she forced herself to maintain civilian response protocols. Engaging with Victor would only make the situation worse, and she could not afford to draw additional attention to herself. Thank you for the advice, she said, her voice carefully neutral. I'll make sure to be better prepared next time. The response should have ended the interaction, But Victor was enjoying his performance too much to stop. He stepped even closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow. In her peripheral vision, she noticed that the man in the expensive suit had paused near the exit and was watching the encounter with obvious interest. "You know what your problem is?" Victor continued, his voice taking on the lecturing tone of someone who thought he was being helpful rather than hostile. "People like you think you can just show up anywhere and expect special treatment. This is government business, not some social service office." The comment stung because it was designed to, and Lena realized that Victor had identified her as foreign despite her perfect English and professional appearance. "People like you" was code for outsider, for someone who did not belong and should be grateful for whatever scraps of consideration she received from the system. She could handle the bureaucratic frustration and even the personal humiliation, but the casual prejudice triggered something deeper than anger. How many times had she put her life on the line for this country? How many operations had she completed to protect civilians exactly like Victor, who would never know her name or understand her sacrifice? The irony was bitter enough to taste. She had given 6 years of her life to military service, had earned distinctions and commendations that would never appear on any public record, and now she was being lectured about patriotism and proper documentation by a security guard who had probably never been closer to real danger than a traffic stop. "I understand your position," Lena said, maintaining eye contact while calculating distances and angles with automatic precision. "I'll schedule an appointment for next week as suggested." But Victor was not finished asserting his authority. He had an audience and an opportunity to demonstrate his power over someone he perceived as vulnerable, and men like him rarely passed up such chances. "You can schedule an appointment, but that doesn't guarantee anything," he said with obvious satisfaction. "Maybe you should consider whether this country is really the right fit for someone who can't handle basic paperwork requirements." The suggestion that she should leave voluntarily was the final insult, and Lena felt her carefully maintained civilian persona beginning to crack. This was her country too, had been her country through 6 years of classified service in places Victor could not pronounce, performing missions he could not imagine. She had earned her place here through sacrifice and blood, not through the accident of birth that had given him his citizenship and his sense of superiority. The man in the expensive suit was definitely watching now, his attention focused entirely on the interaction near the processing desk. Something in his posture suggested he was evaluating the situation, possibly preparing to intervene if Victor continued escalating. The possibility of rescue should have been reassuring, but instead it made Lena's humiliation complete. She had gone from elite operator to civilian victim who needed protection from random strangers. "I appreciate your concern," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to let Victor know he was pushing limits he did not understand. "I'm confident I'll be able to resolve the documentation issues." Victor heard the warning in her tone and interpreted it as defiance rather than restraint. His expression shifted from condescending authority to something that looked almost like anticipation, as if he was hoping she would give him an excuse to escalate the confrontation further. "Attitude like that is exactly why people like you have problems with government agencies," he said, moving even closer until he was well inside her personal space. "Maybe you need to learn some respect for American institutions." The elderly Italian man who had been helped earlier was still sitting nearby, and Lena could see him watching the confrontation with obvious distress. He understood enough English to recognize bullying when he saw it, and his grateful expression from earlier had been replaced by sympathetic concern for her situation. The family with 3 children had stopped trying to organize their paperwork and was openly staring at the scene Victor was creating. The mother looked uncomfortable, clearly wanting to intervene, but uncertain how to help without making things worse. Even the embassy officials behind the processing desk had stopped working and were watching to see how far Victor would push the confrontation. Lena realized that this moment was bigger than just her personal frustration with bureaucracy. Everyone in the room was watching to see whether Victor's bullying would be challenged or allowed to continue unchecked. Her response would set the tone for how he treated every future applicant who seemed vulnerable or different. The knowledge that her actions mattered to other people should have made her more cautious, but instead it crystallized her resolve. She had not spent years defending civilians just to let some petty tyrant terrorize them in a government building. There were ways to handle men like Victor without compromising her civilian cover, ways to establish boundaries without revealing her true capabilities. "Thank you for your guidance," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority she had learned to project when de-escalating dangerous situations. "I'm sure you have other important duties to attend to." The polite dismissal was perfectly calibrated to put Victor in his place without giving him grounds for further escalation. But instead of backing down, he chose to interpret her words as a challenge to his authority. His face flushed with anger, and Lena could see him preparing to assert his dominance through the only means available to men like him when their authority was questioned. Physical intimidation was coming next. She could see it in his body language, in the way he shifted his weight and clenched his fists. Victor had reached the point where he needed to prove his power through force rather than words, and Lena found herself calculating response options with the automatic precision that had kept her alive through countless hostile encounters. The man in the expensive suit had moved closer, close enough to intervene if necessary, and Lena caught a glimpse of his face as he watched Victor's escalating aggression. His expression was calm but focused, and she realized he was not just observing the situation. He was evaluating her, studying her reactions and responses with the kind of professional interest that suggested he understood exactly what kind of person she really was beneath her civilian disguise. The recognition was mutual and instant, two predators acknowledging each other across a room full of prey. Whatever his background, wherever he had learned to read people and situations with that level of precision, he knew she was not what she appeared to be. Just as she knew he was far more dangerous than his expensive suit and diplomatic business suggested. Victor was still talking, still building up to his moment of physical dominance. But Lena was no longer listening to his words. Her attention was split between calculating her response to his inevitable escalation and processing the implications of being recognized by someone who might represent an entirely different kind of threat to her carefully constructed anonymity. The next few minutes would determine whether she could maintain her civilian cover or whether her old life would finally catch up with her in the most unexpected place imaginable. Either way, Lena realized as she watched Victor's face flush with increasing anger, her quiet existence as a database administrator was about to become significantly more complicated. Victor stepped forward, his bulk casting a shadow across the processing desk where Lena still held her inadequate paperwork. "You know what I think," he said, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of someone who believed he had figured out a puzzle that had been troubling him. "I think you're here under false pretenses." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Lena felt every person in the embassy waiting room turn their attention toward the unfolding confrontation. The elderly Italian man looked distressed. The mother with 3 children had gathered them closer to her chair, and even the embassy officials behind the processing counter had stopped their work to observe Victor's increasingly aggressive behavior. "What exactly are you implying?" Lena asked, her voice carefully modulated to sound concerned rather than threatening. She could feel the familiar tactical assessment mode kicking in despite her determination to handle this situation through civilian protocols. Victor was approximately 6 feet tall, probably 200 pounds, carrying extra weight around his midsection that would slow his movements. Right-handed based on his positioning, no obvious weapons beyond the standard security equipment on his belt. Victor's smile held no warmth as he gestured toward her documents. "Security consultant for 5 years. But you can't provide a single certification or training record. No references from previous employers? No documentation of the experience you claim to have. That sounds like someone who's been lying on government forms." The suggestion that she was committing fraud sent a spike of genuine anger through Lena's chest. She had filled out every form truthfully within the constraints of her classified background, had paid every fee, had followed every rule designed to ensure legitimate visa holders could work legally in the country. The fact that her military service record was classified did not make her a criminal, and Victor's implication that she was somehow cheating the system struck at everything she had sacrificed to earn her citizenship. "I provided all the documentation that was available to me," Lena said, maintaining eye contact while calculating the distance to the nearest exit. "My previous work involved confidential security arrangements that included non-disclosure agreements preventing me from sharing client information. It was a reasonable explanation that should have satisfied anyone with basic understanding of security consulting, but Victor was not interested in reasonable explanations. He was interested in exercising power over someone he perceived as vulnerable, and Lena's calm responses were only fueling his determination to provoke a reaction that would justify further escalation. Confidential security arrangements, Victor repeated with obvious skepticism. That's convenient. You know what I think? I think you've been working illegally, and now you're trying to get legitimate documentation to cover your tracks. The accusation was serious enough to result in immediate deportation if Victor decided to file an official complaint, and Lena realized that this confrontation had moved beyond simple bureaucratic harassment into territory that could destroy her carefully constructed civilian life. She needed to de-escalate the situation quickly before Victor's suspicions attracted the attention of embassy officials with actual authority to investigate her background. I understand your concerns, she said, adopting the submissive tone that men like Victor expected from women they were intimidating. Perhaps I should speak with your supervisor about the best way to provide additional documentation for my visa renewal. But Victor was not interested in involving his supervisor, especially not when he was enjoying his moment of dominance over someone he had identified as an outsider who did not deserve the protection of American institutions. He stepped even closer, close enough that Lena could see the small scar above his eyebrow and smell the coffee on his breath, mixed with something that suggested he had been drinking earlier in the day. My supervisor doesn't need to be bothered with people who can't follow simple rules, he said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone of someone who believed he was providing a valuable public service by making her experience as unpleasant as possible. What you need to do is admit that you don't have the qualifications you claimed and apply under the correct category. The demand that she confess to lying was designed to humiliate her in front of the other applicants while establishing Victor's authority over the situation. It was a classic intimidation technique, forcing the target to choose between public humiliation and escalating conflict with someone who held institutional power. In her previous life, Lena would have ended such encounters within seconds, but civilian rules required her to accept whatever indignities Victor chose to impose. I'll certainly consider your suggestion, she said, gathering her documents with movements that appeared calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Thank you for your guidance. I'll schedule an appointment to discuss alternative application categories. The polite response should have ended the confrontation with Victor's authority established and his ego satisfied, but instead of allowing her to leave, he moved to block her path toward the exit. His positioning was deliberate, designed to prevent her from walking away until he had finished asserting his dominance over the situation. Where do you think you're going? He asked, his tone suggesting that attempting to leave was evidence of guilt rather than a reasonable response to his harassment. We're not finished discussing your documentation problems. Lena felt the last threads of her civilian patience beginning to fray as she realized that Victor had no intention of allowing this confrontation to end on any terms except his own complete victory. He wanted her to break down, to beg for his mercy, to provide him with the kind of satisfying submission that would confirm his power over people he considered inferior. The elderly Italian man was watching the encounter with obvious distress, clearly recognizing the dynamic even if he could not understand all the words being spoken. The man in the expensive suit had moved closer as well, positioning himself where he could observe the interaction while maintaining the pretense of checking his phone. There was something about his stillness that suggested he was prepared to intervene if the situation escalated beyond verbal intimidation. I'd prefer to schedule a formal appointment rather than continuing this discussion in the waiting area, Lena said, making one final attempt to resolve the situation through civilian protocols. Other people are waiting to be served, and I don't want to take up more of your time. Victor's face flushed with anger at her suggestion that he was neglecting his duties, and Lena saw him cross the line from professional harassment into personal vendetta. His next words confirmed what she had already recognized from his body language and positioning. You're not going anywhere until we resolve this issue, he said, reaching toward her arm with obvious intention to prevent her from leaving through physical restraint. People like you need to learn that there are consequences for trying to cheat the system. The moment his fingers closed around her wrist, Every instinct Lena had developed through years of combat training overrode her determination to maintain civilian behavior. The physical contact was not just harassment, it was assault, and her body responded with the automatic precision that had kept her alive through countless hostile encounters. The disarm happened faster than conscious thought. Lena's free hand came up to break Victor's grip while her body turned to create leverage, and suddenly Victor found himself face down against the processing desk with his arm twisted behind his back in a textbook control hold that left him completely immobilized. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds and involved no strikes or obvious violence, just the kind of surgical precision that came from thousands of hours of training. The waiting room erupted in shocked silence as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Victor, who had been dominating the interaction through size and institutional authority, was now pinned helplessly against a desk by a woman who appeared to have moved without effort. His face was pressed against the paperwork he had been using to humiliate others, and his attempts to struggle only demonstrated how completely his advantage had been neutralized. But the physical reversal was not what made Lena's blood run cold as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. During the brief struggle, Victor's grabbing had torn the sleeve of her blazer, and the fabric had pulled back to reveal the tattoo on her inner wrist that she had kept hidden for 18 months. The Navy SEAL trident was small and discreet, designed to be concealed under normal circumstances, but now it was clearly visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The man in the expensive suit knew exactly what he was looking at. Lena caught his gaze across the room and saw immediate recognition in his eyes as he processed the significance of the military insignia now exposed on her wrist. There was no surprise in his expression, only the satisfied look of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. He had been evaluating her from the moment she entered the embassy, reading the subtle signs of combat training in her posture and movement, and now he had visual confirmation of what he had already suspected. Release him, she told herself, but her training was screaming warnings about letting go of a neutralized threat before securing the area. Victor was no longer the primary concern. The real danger was standing 20 feet away, studying her exposed tattoo with the kind of professional interest that suggested he understood exactly what it meant to find a former Navy SEAL working under civilian cover in a Queen's embassy. Lena forced herself to release Victor and step back, pulling the torn sleeve down to cover her wrist as she did so. But the damage was already done. Victor stumbled away from the desk, his face red with humiliation and rage, while embassy officials rushed forward to restore order to the chaos that had erupted in their waiting room. What the hell was that? Victor shouted, his voice cracking with the kind of outrage that came from having his authority completely demolished in front of an audience. She attacked me. I want her arrested. The embassy security supervisor appeared as if summoned by the commotion, an older man in a suit who took in the scene with obvious disapproval for everyone involved. Victor was still shouting about being assaulted while trying to restore his dignity. The other applicants were murmuring among themselves about what they had witnessed, and Lena was standing in the middle of it all with her torn sleeve and exposed military background. "Sir," she said to the supervisor, adopting the respectful tone appropriate for addressing authority while her mind raced through options for damage control. "There was a misunderstanding. I was trying to leave, and there was accidental physical contact that startled me. I apologize if my reaction seemed excessive." It was a reasonable explanation that attributed the encounter to accident rather than deliberate confrontation, but Victor was not willing to accept any narrative that did not cast him as the victim of unprovoked attack. She grabbed my arm and threw me against the desk. He insisted, his voice rising to attract the attention of everyone in the building. "I want to press charges." The supervisor looked between Victor's flushed face and Lena's calm demeanor, clearly trying to determine what had actually happened based on the conflicting accounts and obvious tension. The other applicants were watching the proceedings with the fascination that came from witnessing drama that did not directly affect them. But Lena was focused entirely on the man in the expensive suit, who was still studying her with undisguised interest. He had witnessed the entire encounter, from Victor's initial harassment through the final physical confrontation that had exposed her military background. More importantly, he had recognized the significance of her tattoo and the implications of finding someone with her training working under civilian cover. The look in his eyes suggested he was already planning how to use this information to his advantage. "Ma'am," the supervisor said, addressing Lena with professional courtesy that suggested he was inclined to believe her version of events over Victor's emotional accusations. "Can you explain what happened from your perspective?" Lena realized that her next words would determine whether this incident remained a minor bureaucratic dispute or escalated into the kind of official investigation that would destroy her civilian identity completely. She could feel Victor's angry gaze, the supervisor's professional evaluation, and most dangerously, the calculating attention of the man who now knew exactly what she was hiding. "I was gathering my documents to leave when there was accidental contact," she said, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that every detail mattered. "I reacted instinctively to being grabbed, and I apologize if my response seemed disproportionate. It was not my intention to cause a disturbance." The explanation was technically accurate while omitting the context that would have revealed Victor's deliberate harassment and her own military training. But even as she spoke, Lena knew that the damage to her cover was irreversible. Too many people had witnessed her tactical precision, and at least one observer understood exactly what that precision implied about her background. Victor was still protesting his innocence and demanding that charges be filed. But the supervisor was clearly more interested in resolving the situation quickly than in conducting a thorough investigation that would reflect poorly on embassy security protocols. After a brief consultation with the embassy officials who had witnessed the encounter, he reached the conclusion that Lena had obviously hoped for. "This appears to have been a misunderstanding that got out of hand," he announced with the tone of someone who wanted the incident forgotten as quickly as possible. "I suggest everyone return to their business, and we'll consider the matter closed." Victor's face went even redder at the suggestion that his assault complaint was being dismissed, but his supervisor's decision was final. The other applicants gradually returned their attention to their own paperwork, while the embassy officials resumed processing applications with obvious relief that the crisis had been resolved without requiring higher-level intervention. But as Lena gathered her documents and prepared to leave, she could feel the weight of observation from the man in the expensive suit, who was still standing near the exit. He had witnessed everything, understood everything, and now he knew exactly who and what she was beneath her civilian disguise. The question was not whether he would use this information, but when and how he would approach her with whatever proposition had brought him to this embassy in the first place. As she walked toward the exit, Lena caught his eye one final time and saw the slight nod of acknowledgement that confirmed her worst fears. Her 18 months of civilian anonymity had just ended in the most unexpected way possible, and whatever came next would depend entirely on the intentions of a man who clearly understood the value of finding a former Navy SEAL hiding in plain sight. Antonio Rossi waited 30 seconds after Lena disappeared through the embassy exit before following, his years of experience in situations requiring discretion making the timing automatic. He had learned long ago that the most valuable intelligence came from observing people when they believed they were unobserved, and the woman with the Navy SEAL tattoo had just provided him with the kind of opportunity that could change everything about his current situation. The autumn afternoon was crisp with the promise of winter, and the sidewalks around the embassy were crowded with the usual mix of applicants, government workers, and neighborhood residents going about their daily business. Antonio spotted Lena immediately despite the crowd, her posture and movement patterns making her as distinctive as a signature to someone who understood how to read body language and tactical awareness. She walked with the controlled efficiency of someone who had been trained to move through hostile environments, her head turning at precisely calculated intervals to scan for threats while maintaining the appearance of casual civilian behavior. Most people would have seen nothing unusual in her conduct, but Antonio recognized the habits of someone whose survival had once depended on constant situational awareness. He maintained a distance of approximately 50 meters while cataloging every detail of her route and behavior. She avoided walking directly beneath overhanging structures that could conceal watchers, chose the side of the sidewalk that provided multiple escape routes, and periodically used reflective surfaces to check for surveillance without obviously looking over her shoulder. Professional-level counter-surveillance, executed with the kind of unconscious precision that suggested years of training and operational experience. Most interesting of all, she noticed his presence within 6 blocks of the embassy. Antonio saw the subtle shift in her movement pattern that indicated awareness of being followed, though she gave no obvious sign of alarm or concern. Instead, she began implementing standard evasion protocols, taking seemingly random turns and pausing at shop windows in ways that would allow her to identify and catalog anyone maintaining consistent distance behind her. The fact that she had detected his surveillance so quickly confirmed his assessment of her capabilities while presenting him with an interesting tactical challenge. Antonio had been conducting discreet observation missions since he was 16 years old, and very few people possessed the skill to recognize his presence when he chose to remain hidden. Either she was extremely lucky, or her training had been far more extensive than even he had suspected. He decided to test her abilities by increasing the complexity of his approach. Instead of maintaining direct pursuit, Antonio used the parallel street technique, moving along a route that would intersect with hers at predetermined intervals while staying outside her direct line of sight. It was a method that required intimate knowledge of the neighborhood geography and perfect timing, but it would allow him to continue observation while determining whether her detection had been skill or coincidence. 20 minutes later, Antonio was certain that Lena Thorne was everything her tattoo suggested and more. She had not only maintained awareness of his adjusted surveillance pattern, but had begun implementing counter-tracking measures that indicated formal training in urban evasion techniques. Twice she had positioned herself where she could observe him without being seen, and once she had deliberately created a situation where he would have been forced to expose himself if he had continued direct pursuit. By the time she reached the modest apartment building in Astoria where she obviously lived, Antonio had filled in most of the missing pieces about her background and capabilities. Former Special Operations, almost certainly Navy SEAL based on the tattoo and her tactical proficiency. Recently transitioned to civilian life based on the slight hesitation in some of her movements that suggested she was still adjusting to non-combat environments. Highly trained, extremely competent, and currently operating under deep cover for reasons he intended to discover. Antonio positioned himself in a coffee shop across the street from her building and pulled out his phone to begin making the calls that would provide him with the information he needed. His first contact was Marco Benedetti, a former military intelligence analyst who now worked private consulting for clients who preferred to remain anonymous. If anyone could provide background information on a former SEAL operating under civilian cover, it would be Marco. The conversation was brief and conducted in the kind of coded language that allowed sensitive information to be exchanged over potentially monitored communication channels. Antonio provided Lena's name, approximate age, and physical description while requesting a comprehensive background investigation focused on recent military service and any classified operations that might explain her current situation. His second call was to Detective Sarah Chun, an NYPD intelligence officer who supplemented her government salary by providing information to clients who could afford her discretion. Antonio had been cultivating Chun for 3 years, and she had proven invaluable for accessing law enforcement databases that contained information unavailable through normal channels. Chun confirmed what Antonio had already suspected. Lena Thorne's current identity was legitimate but recent, with all her documentation dating back less than 2 years. Her employment history showed a brief stint in private security consulting followed by her current position as a database administrator, but there were no records of education or previous employment that would explain her obvious qualifications for either position. More interesting was Chin's observation that someone matching Lena's description had been linked to several high-profile security consultations in the past 18 months, all involving situations that required the kind of specialized skills normally associated with military special operations. 3 corporate executives had hired private security after receiving credible death threats, and all 3 situations had been resolved through methods that suggested their consultant possessed combat training far beyond typical civilian security personnel. Antonio ended the call with Chun and immediately dialed his most sensitive contact, a man known only as Phoenix who specialized in accessing classified military records for clients who could afford his services and guarantee his anonymity. Phoenix operated from somewhere in Eastern Europe and charged premium rates for information that could result in federal prosecution if traced back to its source. The conversation with Phoenix required careful negotiation regarding price and security protocols, but Antonio's reputation and history of reliable payment eventually secured the services he needed. Within 2 hours, Phoenix would have accessed whatever classified records existed regarding former SEAL team members who had transitioned to civilian status in the past 2 years. While waiting for Phoenix to complete his investigation, Antonio observed Lena's apartment building and considered the implications of what he had discovered. Finding a former Navy SEAL operating under civilian cover in Queens was either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence that she was involved in activities that intersected with his own business interests. Either way, she represented exactly the kind of asset that could solve several of his current problems while creating new opportunities for expansion. Antonio's organization was in the process of transitioning from traditional organized crime activities to legitimate business operations, a complex process that required navigating threats from rival families while protecting his assets and personnel. The transition had created security vulnerabilities that conventional criminal muscle could not address, situations that required the kind of tactical expertise and operational planning that only someone with special operations background could provide. More immediately, Antonio was facing pressure from the Torino family, whose recent expansion into his territory had resulted in several violent confrontations that threatened to escalate into open warfare. The Torinos had military veterans in their organization, former Marines and Army Rangers who had given them tactical advantages that Antonio's traditional enforcers could not match. Finding someone with SEAL-level capabilities could tip the balance decisively in his favor. But beyond the immediate tactical benefits, Antonio was intrigued by the personal challenge Lena represented. In 20 years of criminal activity, he had rarely encountered anyone whose capabilities might exceed his own, especially not someone who appeared to be operating independently without organizational backing. The combination of her obvious competence and apparent isolation suggested possibilities that extended far beyond simple employment arrangements. His phone buzzed with a text from Phoenix indicating that the initial investigation was complete and results were available through their usual secure communication channel. Antonio accessed the encrypted files and began reading the most comprehensive background investigation he had ever purchased. Lena Thorne, formerly Petty Officer First Class Elena Thorson, had served 6 years with Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the most elite unit within the SEAL community. Her service record included deployments to Afghanistan, Syria, and several locations that remained classified even in Phoenix's files. She had earned 3 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, and commendations for operations that were still considered state secrets. More significantly, her departure from military service had been voluntary but sudden, occurring shortly after an operation in Syria that had resulted in the deaths of 4 team members and left her as one of only 2 survivors. The after-action report was classified beyond Phoenix's access level, but medical records indicated she had been treated for injuries consistent with explosive ordnance and had undergone psychological evaluation for post-traumatic stress disorder. The picture that emerged was of an elite operator who had left military service following a traumatic mission that had cost her most of her team. Her subsequent civilian identity and careful anonymity suggested she was seeking to escape not just her military past, but the psychological burdens that came with surviving when her friends had not. Antonio closed the files and considered his approach. Lena was clearly running from something, whether it was external enemies, psychological trauma, or simply the weight of her own capabilities in a civilian world that could not understand or appreciate what she had sacrificed in service to her country. Any approach would need to acknowledge her desire for anonymity while demonstrating that he could provide something she needed more than continued isolation. The opportunity to make contact came sooner than he had anticipated. Lena emerged from her apartment building wearing civilian clothing and walking with the slightly different posture that suggested she was off-duty and attempting to blend with normal neighborhood activity. She entered a small coffee shop 2 blocks from her building, the same establishment Antonio had been observing from across the street. Antonio waited 5 minutes before following her into the coffee shop, timing his arrival to appear coincidental while positioning himself where they could interact naturally. The interior was typical of neighborhood establishments that catered to working professionals and local residents, with small tables arranged to encourage conversation and windows that provided clear sight lines to the surrounding streets. Lena had chosen a table near the back wall that offered multiple escape routes and clear observation of anyone entering or leaving the establishment. She was reading something on her tablet while drinking what appeared to be black coffee, but Antonio could see her peripheral awareness tracking every customer and employee in the space. He approached the counter and ordered an espresso, allowing his slight Italian accent to be noticeable while maintaining the kind of professional courtesy that would mark him as someone who belonged in this neighborhood. When his order was ready, he turned toward the seating area and allowed his gaze to meet Lena's with the expression of someone who was mildly surprised to encounter a familiar face in an unexpected context. "Excuse me," he said, moving toward her table with the confidence of someone who was accustomed to initiating conversations with strangers. "Weren't you at the embassy earlier today? I remember seeing you during that unfortunate situation with the security guard." Lena looked up from her tablet with an expression that appeared politely interested while her eyes conducted the kind of rapid threat assessment that Antonio recognized from his own tactical training. She was evaluating his positioning, hand placement, potential weapons, and escape routes while maintaining the facade of civilian social interaction. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying a slight tension that suggested she was prepared for this encounter to escalate in any direction. "That was quite an unpleasant experience. I hope you were able to complete your business without similar difficulties." The response was perfectly calibrated to acknowledge their shared experience while providing no information about her own situation or intentions. Antonio recognized the technique from his own training in information security, and her skill at deflecting inquiry while maintaining conversational flow confirmed his assessment of her professional background. "Fortunately, my business was much more straightforward than yours appeared to be," he replied, gesturing toward the empty chair across from her table. "May I? I'm Antonio Rossi, and I have to admit that I was impressed by how calmly you handled what could have been a very difficult situation." The introduction was deliberately incomplete, providing his real first name while omitting any details that would allow her to research his background or organizational affiliations. At the same time, his compliment acknowledged her tactical performance without explicitly revealing that he had recognized her military training. Lena hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before indicating that he could join her, the brief pause suggesting she was calculating risks and benefits while maintaining social protocols. "Of course," she said, closing her tablet to signal that she was willing to engage in conversation. "Lena Thorne, I have to say, that guard seemed to be having a particularly difficult day." Her version of events attributed Victor's behavior to personal problems rather than systematic harassment, a diplomatic interpretation that avoided discussing the confrontation's more serious implications. But her choice to provide her real name suggested either confidence in her civilian identity or recognition that Antonio already possessed information that made continued anonymity pointless. "Some people handle authority poorly," Antonio replied as he settled into the chair across from her. "I've found that men like Victor often create problems for others because they lack the confidence that comes from genuine competence." The observation was designed to demonstrate his understanding of power dynamics while providing insight into his own perspective on leadership and authority. Lena's response would indicate whether she recognized the subtext or chose to maintain strictly civilian conversation. "That's a very perceptive observation," she said, her tone suggesting genuine interest while her posture remained subtly defensive. "You speak from experience with management challenges?" The question probed for information about his professional background while maintaining conversational flow, and Antonio realized that she was conducting her own assessment of his capabilities and potential threat level. The mutual evaluation was proceeding exactly as he had hoped, with both participants recognizing the other as worthy of careful consideration. "You could say that," Antonio replied with the slight smile that had disarmed countless opponents over the years. "I've learned that true authority comes from competence rather than position, and that the most dangerous people are often the ones who appear most harmless." The last statement was a direct acknowledgement that he had recognized her military background while establishing that he possessed his own understanding of violence and deception. Lena's response would determine whether their conversation continued as careful professional evaluation or escalated to direct confrontation about their respective hidden agendas. Her smile in return was equally calculated and far more dangerous than anything Victor could have imagined. "That's very true," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to confirm that she understood exactly what he was telling her. "I've found that appearances can be extremely deceiving, especially when people have reasons to conceal their true capabilities." The words hung between them like a challenge and acknowledgement simultaneously, and Lena found herself remembering the last time she had engaged in this kind of careful verbal sparring with someone who might be equally dangerous. It had been in Syria, during the final mission that had ended her military career and changed everything about how she understood loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of survival. The flashback hit her without warning, triggered by Antonio's obvious competence and the familiar tension of evaluating a potential threat who might also represent opportunity. She was back in the safe house in Aleppo, conducting exactly this kind of cautious assessment with a local contact who claimed to have intelligence about insurgent weapon caches. Marcus had been sitting across from her then, reading the contact's body language while she handled the verbal negotiation, both of them aware that their lives depended on correctly identifying whether the man was legitimate ally or sophisticated enemy. 3 hours later, Marcus and 2 other team members were dead, killed by the explosive device their contact had led them to while claiming it was an abandoned insurgent position. Lena had survived only because her tactical instincts had made her hang back when something felt wrong about the target building's positioning. But her caution had not been enough to save her friends. She had spent the next 18 months in civilian therapy trying to process the guilt of being the sole survivor when her teammates had trusted her judgment about their local contact. The memory faded as quickly as it had come, but it left Lena with the familiar weight of understanding that her ability to read people and situations was both blessing and curse. She had survived Syria precisely because she could recognize danger in subtle behavioral cues and tactical positioning. But that same skill now made it impossible for her to interact with anyone without calculating threat assessments and escape routes. Looking at Antonio across the coffee shop table, Lena realized that her 18 months of civilian anonymity had been borrowed time that was rapidly running out. Too many people had now witnessed her capabilities, from Victor's colleagues who had seen her tactical response to this obviously connected man who had recognized her military background. Even if she could disappear again, create another identity in another city, the pattern would eventually attract attention from people with resources to track former special operations personnel. More troubling was her growing certainty that she no longer wanted to run. The coffee shop conversation with Antonio was the first genuine intellectual challenge she had encountered since leaving military service, the first interaction with someone who might actually understand the world she had come from and the capabilities she had tried so hard to bury. His obvious respect for her skills was intoxicating after months of hiding her true nature from civilian colleagues who saw her as nothing more than a competent database administrator. Perhaps it was time to stop running from what she was and find a way to use her training for something meaningful again. The question was whether Antonio represented an opportunity for purpose or simply a different kind of danger that would eventually destroy what remained of her attempts at normal life. "I think we understand each other quite well," Antonio said, his tone carrying the satisfaction of someone whose careful approach had achieved exactly the result he had intended. "The question is whether that understanding might lead to a mutually beneficial professional relationship." The offer was presented with perfect ambiguity, providing no specific details about what kind of professional relationship he had in mind, while making it clear that he was proposing something that would utilize her military background. Lena could refuse and maintain her civilian cover, or she could acknowledge her interest and discover what Antonio's recognition of her abilities might offer. "What kind of professional relationship did you have in mind?" she asked, crossing the line from civilian caution to tactical negotiation with a choice that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "The kind that would allow someone with your particular expertise to find meaningful work that actually challenges their capabilities," Antonio replied, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was offering. "I have business interests that occasionally require the kind of security consulting that goes beyond what conventional firms can provide." Security consulting was code for activities that would utilize her combat training, and business interests suggested organizational backing that could provide resources and protection in exchange for services. It was exactly the kind of proposition Lena had been both hoping for and dreading since leaving military service. An opportunity to use her skills for something more significant than database management, while potentially stepping into a world that could be as dangerous as the one she had left behind. "That sounds potentially interesting," she said, committing to nothing while indicating willingness to hear more details. "What kind of security challenges are you currently facing?" The question moved their conversation from careful assessment to preliminary negotiation, and Lena felt the familiar adrenaline rush that came with accepting a mission that could change everything about her current situation. Whether Antonio represented salvation or destruction, her quiet civilian existence was officially over. Antonio leaned back in his chair, studying Lena's face with the kind of careful attention that suggested her answer would determine the direction of their entire conversation. "The security challenges I'm currently facing are both personal and professional," he said, his tone shifting from casual conversation to business discussion. "My family has been involved in import and export operations for 3 generations, and that kind of longevity in international trade creates both opportunities and complications." Import and export operations was careful phrasing that could describe anything from legitimate shipping to organized crime, and Lena recognized the deliberate ambiguity as a test of her sophistication about the world beyond conventional business practices. His mention of family complications suggested organizational conflicts that required the kind of security solutions typically associated with criminal enterprises rather than traditional corporate concerns. "What kind of complications?" she asked, committing herself to hearing more details while maintaining the option to withdraw if his proposition proved more dangerous than beneficial. "The kind that arise when competitors decide that cooperation is less profitable than conflict," Antonio replied, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who had been forced to respond to threats rather than initiate them. "Recent developments have created situations that require security expertise beyond what conventional firms can provide." Lena understood that he was describing turf wars or territorial disputes between criminal organizations, conflicts that would involve violence and intimidation rather than normal business competition. The fact that he needed someone with her specific background suggested that his enemies possessed military training or tactical capabilities that his current security arrangements could not match. More specifically, Antonio continued, his eyes never leaving her face as he evaluated her reactions to increasingly sensitive information. "My family has been targeted by people who believe that violence is an acceptable business practice. They've already made attempts to harm my mother and other family members, and I have reason to believe they're planning more aggressive action in the immediate future." The revelation that his elderly mother had been threatened transformed the conversation from abstract business negotiation to personal protection mission, and Lena felt her tactical instincts engaging despite her determination to maintain civilian detachment. Targeting family members, especially elderly non-combatants, violated codes of conduct that existed even in the most ruthless criminal organizations. "That's a serious situation," she said, her voice carrying genuine concern while her mind automatically began calculating response scenarios. "Have you involved law enforcement, or are there complications that make official channels impractical?" Law enforcement has limited effectiveness when dealing with people who consider themselves above conventional legal constraints, Antonio replied with the bitter tone of someone who had learned hard lessons about the boundaries of official protection. "My family needs security professionals who understand that some threats require unconventional responses." Unconventional responses meant extra-legal action, possibly including violence that would never be reported to authorities or investigated through official channels. Lena was being offered the opportunity to return to a world where problems were solved through force and tactical superiority rather than paperwork and bureaucratic procedures. The prospect should have been alarming, but instead she found herself intrigued by the possibility of using her training for something that mattered again. Protecting innocent family members from criminal threats was exactly the kind of mission that had originally motivated her to pursue military service, and Antonio's obvious respect for her capabilities was a stark contrast to the civilian world's tendency to see her as nothing more than another office worker. "What specific skills are you looking for?" Lena asked, crossing another line in the progression from casual conversation to professional negotiation. "Someone who can conduct threat assessment and personal protection for high-risk individuals, Antonio said, his tone indicating that he had anticipated her question and prepared his answer carefully. Someone who understands tactical planning and can coordinate security operations that account for sophisticated opposition. Most importantly, someone who can be trusted with family safety when conventional security measures have proven inadequate. The job description encompassed everything from bodyguard duties to tactical planning and potentially combat operations, depending on how aggressive his enemies chose to become. It was exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes assignment that would utilize her full skill set while providing the sense of purpose she had been missing since leaving military service. That sounds like it could be very challenging work, Lena said, her voice carrying interest while maintaining professional distance. What kind of compensation and time frame are you considering? Very generous compensation for the right person, Antonio replied without hesitation. This isn't temporary employment. I'm looking for someone who can become a permanent part of my family's security infrastructure, someone who understands that protecting people you care about isn't just a job, it's a commitment. The offer was both professional opportunity and personal invitation, suggesting that successful completion of family protection duties could lead to permanent integration into Antonio's organization and lifestyle. It was exactly the kind of belonging Lena had been seeking since leaving military service, the possibility of finding people who understood her capabilities and appreciated her willingness to risk everything for their safety. Before she could respond, Antonio's phone buzzed with an incoming message that made his expression shift from business discussion to immediate tactical concern. He read the text quickly, then looked at Lena with the kind of focused attention that suggested their conversation had just become much more urgent than either of them had anticipated. It appears that my enemies have become aware of my interest in expanding my security capabilities, he said, his voice carrying controlled tension. They've been conducting surveillance of their own, and they may have identified you as someone I've been considering for employment. The implication that rival criminals had been watching their coffee shop meeting sent a chill through Lena's chest as she realized that her attempt to maintain civilian anonymity might have failed more completely than she had imagined. If Antonio's enemies possessed surveillance capabilities sufficient to identify and track potential security consultants, her embassy encounter with Victor might have been only the beginning of her exposure. How immediate is the concern? She asked, automatically shifting into tactical mode as she assessed the coffee shop's exits and evaluated nearby civilians for potential threat indicators. Very immediate, Antonio replied, standing from the table with movements that suggested he was prepared to transition from business discussion to crisis management without hesitation. My people have identified at least 2 vehicles conducting surveillance of this location, and there's been unusual activity around your apartment building for the past hour. Lena felt her stomach drop as she understood that her 18 months of careful anonymity had been shattered not just by one embassy encounter, but by organized criminal investigation that had identified her as a person of interest. Whether she accepted Antonio's employment offer or not, she was now involved in his conflicts simply by virtue of having attracted his attention. We need to leave, she said, gathering her belongings with the efficient movements that came from years of mission planning under time pressure. My apartment is no longer secure if they've been conducting surveillance there. Actually, Antonio said, his tone carrying the satisfaction of someone whose tactical planning had anticipated this exact scenario. I think it might be more productive to let them make their approach. You'll have the opportunity to demonstrate your capabilities while I observe how they operate when they believe they have the advantage. The suggestion that they use her as bait to evaluate enemy tactics should have been insulting, but instead Lena found herself impressed by Antonio's strategic thinking and his confidence in her ability to handle whatever his rivals might attempt. It was the kind of calculated risk that separated professional operators from amateur security personnel. What level of response are you anticipating? She asked, accepting his tactical assessment while ensuring they both understood the potential consequences of allowing the confrontation to develop. Intimidation rather than elimination, most likely, Antonio replied as they left the coffee shop together. They'll want to demonstrate their capabilities while gathering information about yours. But you should be prepared for the possibility that they're more aggressive than my intelligence suggests. They walked toward Lena's apartment building with the appearance of casual conversation, while both maintained tactical awareness of their surroundings. Antonio's confidence in her abilities was gratifying, but Lena was focused primarily on identifying potential threat sources and escape routes should the situation escalate beyond manageable parameters. The first indication of surveillance came 2 blocks from her building, when Lena noticed the same dark sedan that had been parked near the coffee shop, now maintaining parallel movement along a side street. The vehicle contained at least 2 occupants and was being driven with the kind of professional precision that suggested organized criminal resources rather than amateur intimidation. The second vehicle became apparent when they turned onto her street, and Antonio indicated a utility van positioned with clear sight lines to her apartment building entrance. The van's occupants were attempting to appear like workers taking a break, but their positioning and attention patterns marked them as surveillance personnel conducting reconnaissance in preparation for approach. 3 men minimum, Lena observed quietly, cataloging visible personnel while scanning for additional assets that might be positioned out of sight. Probably armed, definitely coordinated. They're waiting for us to enter the building where they can control the environment. Antonio nodded approvingly at her tactical assessment. They've been positioning themselves for about an hour, according to my sources. The question is whether we give them what they're expecting or change the dynamic in our favor. Lena considered the options while observing the men near her building entrance. Confronting them in the open street would attract civilian attention and potentially involve innocent bystanders in violence. Allowing them to make their approach in her building would provide tactical advantages, but could result in property damage and complications with law enforcement. Let them make their approach, she decided, choosing the option that would provide the most information about enemy capabilities while demonstrating her own skills under pressure. But I want to understand what level of response you're expecting from me before we commit to this course of action. Whatever level is necessary to ensure your safety while gathering intelligence about their operational methods, Antonio replied without hesitation. My priority is evaluating whether you're the right person to protect my family, and theirs is probably determining whether you represent a threat to their plans for my organization. The mutual evaluation aspect of the coming confrontation was exactly what Lena had suspected, and she found herself looking forward to the opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that had been dormant for too long. Whether or not she ultimately accepted Antonio's employment offer, she was tired of hiding her true nature from people who might actually appreciate professional competence. They approached her building entrance with the casual demeanor of 2 people who had no awareness of being watched, but Lena was conducting final tactical preparations while Antonio positioned himself to observe the encounter without interfering unless absolutely necessary. The men near the entrance straightened as they approached, confirming that the confrontation was about to begin. The leader was approximately 6 feet tall, built like someone who spent significant time in prison weight rooms, with the kind of facial scarring that suggested experience with violence. His 2 companions were younger but carried themselves with similar confidence, and all 3 wore clothing that concealed weapons while allowing freedom of movement. "Excuse me, miss," the leader said as Lena reached for her building entrance, his tone carrying false politeness that was designed to seem reasonable to any witnesses while establishing control over the interaction. "We'd like to have a conversation with you about some mutual friends." Lena paused with her hand on the door handle, every instinct screaming warnings about the trap that was about to close around her. But instead of fear, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat, the sensation she had been missing since leaving military service 18 months ago. "I'm sorry," she replied with perfect civilian courtesy, "but I don't think we have any mutual friends. Perhaps you're looking for someone else?" "No, we're definitely looking for you," the second man said, moving closer in a flanking position that would prevent her from reaching the building entrance without going through him. "You've been having coffee with people who owe us money, and that makes you part of the conversation." The suggestion that Antonio owed them money was obviously false, designed to provide justification for their intimidation while implying that Lena had unknowingly become involved in criminal business disputes. But their positioning and coordination indicated they were planning to escalate beyond conversation regardless of her responses. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Lena said, releasing her grip on the door handle while shifting her weight to improve balance and reaction time. "I'm not involved in anyone's financial arrangements." "Maybe not yet," the leader replied with a smile that held no warmth, but you're about to become very involved. See, when people start making new friends in our neighborhood, we like to make sure everyone understands the local rules. The threat was delivered with confidence born of experience intimidating people who had no effective response to organized criminal pressure. But as the three men moved to surround her completely, Lena realized they had made the same mistake Victor had made at the embassy. They were assuming that her civilian appearance indicated civilian capabilities, and that assumption was about to prove very costly. What exactly are the local rules? She asked, buying time to complete her tactical assessment while allowing them to position themselves exactly where she wanted them. Rule number 1, the leader said, reaching toward her arm with the same grabbing motion Victor had used, is that everyone shows proper respect for people who run this neighborhood. The moment his hand made contact with her jacket sleeve, Lena's 18 months of civilian restraint ended completely. Her response was faster and more violent than anything the three men had anticipated, a textbook demonstration of close-quarters combat that neutralized all three threats in less than 15 seconds. The leader found himself face down on the concrete with his arm twisted behind his back in a joint lock that would break bones if he attempted to struggle. His second companion was gasping for breath after a strike to the solar plexus that had dropped him to his knees, and the third man was sitting against the building wall with a dazed expression that suggested mild concussion from having his head bounced off brick. The entire encounter had been conducted with surgical precision that avoided permanent injury while demonstrating overwhelming tactical superiority. Lena had neutralized three armed men without drawing weapons or causing damage that would require medical attention, the kind of non-lethal efficiency that marked her as professional rather than amateur. Antonio emerged from his observation position wearing an expression of complete satisfaction as he surveyed the results of Lena's tactical demonstration. Very impressive, he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. Exactly the kind of problem-solving capability my family needs. Lena released the leader and stepped back, allowing the three men to gather themselves while making it clear that further aggression would result in more serious consequences. I think your friends understand the local rules now, she said to Antonio, her voice carrying the controlled adrenaline that followed successful combat operations. The leader struggled to his feet, his face red with humiliation and rage, but his tactical assessment had reached the same conclusion Lena intended. Whatever they had been paid to accomplish through intimidation was not worth risking serious injury against someone with her obvious capabilities. This isn't over, he said, the standard threat that men like him always issued when their authority had been publicly demolished. You have no idea what you just got yourself into. Actually, I think she has a very clear idea, Antonio replied, his tone carrying the quiet menace that marked him as far more dangerous than the three amateur enforcers. The question is whether you understand that continuing this conversation will have consequences your employers haven't prepared you for. The leader looked between Lena and Antonio, obviously calculating whether pride was worth risking further confrontation with people who had demonstrated superior capabilities. After several seconds of internal debate, he chose discretion over valor and gestured for his companions to withdraw. We'll be seeing you around, he said, the final face-saving gesture of someone who needed to maintain some semblance of authority despite his complete tactical defeat. I'm sure we will, Lena replied calmly, watching the three men retreat toward their vehicles while maintaining readiness for renewed confrontation. After they drove away, Antonio turned to face her with an expression that combined professional admiration with personal interest. That was exactly what I hoped to see, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose careful evaluation had confirmed all his expectations. Are you ready to discuss the details of that employment opportunity? Lena looked at the man who had orchestrated her public demonstration of capabilities while providing her with the kind of meaningful challenge she had been missing since leaving military service. Her civilian life was officially over, destroyed by her own choices and enemy surveillance. But the future Antonio was offering might provide something even better than anonymity. Yes, she said, accepting the inevitable while embracing the possibilities. Let's discuss the details. Antonio smiled and stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes and smell the subtle cologne that suggested expensive tastes and careful attention to personal presentation. Before we get to business details, he said, his voice carrying a different kind of tension than their previous tactical discussion, I think we should address the personal dynamics that are obviously developing between us. Lena felt her pulse quicken as she realized that their professional negotiation was about to become much more complicated. What personal dynamics? She asked, maintaining eye contact while her body responded to his proximity with reactions that had nothing to do with tactical assessment. The dynamics that made me want to kiss you about 10 minutes ago, Antonio said with the directness that had marked all their previous conversation, and that are making you consider whether professional boundaries are really as important as you pretended when we were establishing ground rules. The observation was accurate enough that Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks as she acknowledged how completely their mutual attraction had undermined her attempts to maintain professional distance. She had been attracted to his competence and authority from their first conversation, and watching him orchestrate the tactical demonstration had only increased her respect for his strategic thinking and leadership capabilities. You're very perceptive, she admitted, stepping closer instead of retreating from the challenge he represented. But mixing business with personal involvement tends to create complications that compromise operational effectiveness. Sometimes the best partnerships are the ones that acknowledge all the levels on which people connect, Antonio replied, reaching up to touch the small cut on her hand that had resulted from her encounter with the three enforcers. And sometimes the complications are worth the risk. His fingers were gentle against her skin as he examined the minor injury, but the contact sent electricity through her entire nervous system with an intensity that had nothing to do with medical concern and everything to do with the attraction that had been building between them since their first careful conversation. When he looked up from her hand to meet her eyes, Lena made the decision that had been inevitable since the moment she chose to engage him in tactical conversation instead of maintaining civilian anonymity. She kissed him with the intensity of someone who had been denying her own needs for 18 months, and he responded with matching passion that confirmed their mutual recognition as equals in ways that extended far beyond professional capabilities. The kiss was interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance, probably responding to neighbor reports of the confrontation outside her building, and they separated with the knowledge that their personal and professional relationships had just become permanently intertwined. I think we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, Antonio said, his voice carrying the roughness that came from desire barely held in check. My place has significantly better security than yours, and we have business details to discuss that require complete privacy. Lena looked at her apartment building, then at Antonio's face, and realized she was about to make the final choice between her old civilian life and whatever dangerous future he represented. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but for the first time in 18 months, she was looking forward to seeing where she would land. Lead the way, she said, abandoning every safety protocol she had followed since leaving military service in favor of the man who had recognized her true nature and offered her the possibility of finding purpose again. Antonio's compound in the Bronx was everything Lena had expected and more than she had prepared for. The estate occupied nearly 3 acres behind walls that looked decorative but were clearly designed for security, with surveillance cameras positioned at intervals that provided complete coverage while maintaining the illusion of a family residence rather than a fortress. The main house was substantial without being ostentatious, built in the Mediterranean style that suggested old money and established authority. But Lena's tactical eye immediately cataloged the defensive features that marked it as the home of someone who lived with constant security concerns. Reinforced doors, bulletproof windows on the ground floor, and sight lines that had been carefully maintained to provide clear fields of fire from multiple defensive positions. Your first assignment is tomorrow evening, Antonio explained as he led her through rooms that managed to feel both elegant and functional. My mother hosts Sunday dinner for the extended family, and recent intelligence suggests that our enemies have been gathering information about our traditional gatherings. The idea of protecting an elderly woman during a family dinner should have been straightforward, but Lena understood that nothing involving Antonio's organization would be simple. How many people typically attend these dinners? She asked, automatically calculating security requirements for protecting multiple civilians in a social setting. Usually between 15 and 20 family members, plus household staff, Antonio replied, his tone carrying the warmth that entered his voice whenever he discussed his mother. My mother insists on maintaining normal family traditions despite recent security concerns, and I've learned that arguing with her about such matters is both futile and counterproductive. The affection in his voice when discussing his mother revealed a side of Antonio that his enemies probably never saw. And Lena found herself curious about the family dynamics that had produced such obvious devotion in a man whose profession required emotional detachment and calculated violence. It also explained why he needed security personnel who could blend protection duties with genuine respect for family relationships. "Tell me about the specific threats you're anticipating," Lena said, shifting into professional mode while they toured the compound's security features. "Are we looking at surveillance, direct confrontation, or something more subtle?" "Intelligence indicates they're planning reconnaissance rather than direct action," Antonio replied, leading her to a monitoring room that contained surveillance equipment rivaling anything she had seen in military installations. "They want to gather information about family members who might be vulnerable to pressure, identify security protocols, and possibly plant listening devices that would provide ongoing intelligence about our operations." The comprehensive surveillance system confirmed that Antonio took family protection seriously while providing Lena with tools that would allow her to maintain tactical awareness throughout the dinner gathering. But more important than the technology was the trust he was demonstrating by giving her complete access to his family's security infrastructure. "This is impressive," she admitted, studying monitors that provided real-time coverage of every approach to the compound. "You've put serious thought into protecting the people you care about. Protecting family is the only thing that matters when everything else about your life involves violence and uncertainty," Antonio said, his voice carrying an intensity that suggested personal experience with loss. "Everything else can be replaced or rebuilt, but the people you love are irreplaceable." The conviction in his statement revealed depths of caring that contradicted every stereotype about criminal leadership, and Lena realized that Antonio's involvement in organized crime was probably more complicated than she had initially assumed. His obvious devotion to family protection suggested someone who had inherited responsibilities he might not have chosen rather than someone who had actively pursued criminal power. "Your mother must be an extraordinary woman to inspire this level of protection," Lena observed, recognizing an opportunity to learn more about the family dynamics that drove Antonio's security concerns. "She survived the transition from Sicily to New York, raised 4 children while my father built his business, and maintained our family traditions through decades of changes that destroyed most of the families we once knew," Antonio replied, his voice carrying pride mixed with worry. "She's also completely fearless when it comes to maintaining family unity, which means she refuses to let security concerns interfere with the gatherings that keep everyone connected." The description painted a picture of a matriarch who had earned respect through decades of strength and sacrifice, someone whose safety was worth any effort or expense. It also explained why Antonio needed security personnel who could provide protection without creating the kind of obvious defensive presence that would make family gatherings feel like military operations. "I understand," Lena said, recognizing the delicate balance between effective protection and maintaining the family atmosphere that Antonio's mother obviously valued. "Tomorrow evening, your family will have normal dinner while I ensure that nothing interrupts their time together." "Exactly what I was hoping you would say," Antonio replied, his smile carrying gratitude that seemed genuine rather than professional courtesy. "My mother will appreciate having someone who understands the importance of family traditions, even if she doesn't need to know all the details about why additional security is necessary." They spent the next hour reviewing security protocols and discussing contingency plans for various threat scenarios. But Lena found herself increasingly aware of the personal trust Antonio was placing in her by involving her so completely in his family's protection. After 18 months of civilian isolation, being trusted with something so important to someone who obviously understood her capabilities was both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. When they finished the security briefing, Antonio led her to a guest suite that had clearly been prepared for extended occupancy rather than temporary visits. The rooms were elegant and comfortable, but more importantly, they provided tactical advantages that suggested he had consulted security experts when designing accommodations for protection personnel. "This is beautiful," Lena said, examining windows that provided clear sight lines while remaining defensible and furniture positioned to allow rapid movement in any direction. You've thought of everything. I've learned that the people who protect my family deserve the best accommodations I can provide, Antonio replied, moving closer with the kind of careful attention that suggested their professional relationship was about to shift into more personal territory. But I have to admit that designing this space with you in mind has made me think about things beyond just security arrangements. The admission that he had been considering her comfort on a personal level sent warmth through Lena's chest, while triggering awareness that their business partnership was developing complications that neither of them had explicitly discussed. She was attracted to his competence and obvious devotion to family protection, but mixing professional responsibilities with personal relationships violated every protocol she had learned during military service. Antonio, she began, intending to establish boundaries that would keep their working relationship professionally appropriate. But he stepped close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes and smell the subtle cologne that had been distracting her since their first coffee shop conversation. I know this is complicated, he said, his voice carrying the honesty that had marked all their previous discussions. But I've never met anyone who understands both the demands of this life and the importance of protecting the people who make it worthwhile. I'm not asking you to compromise your professional standards, just to consider that some partnerships work better when people acknowledge all the ways they connect. The observation was accurate enough that Lena felt her carefully constructed professional distance beginning to dissolve despite her determination to maintain appropriate boundaries. She had been attracted to Antonio's strategic thinking and leadership capabilities from their first encounter, and spending time in his home had only increased her respect for the way he balanced criminal responsibilities with genuine family devotion. More than that, she realized as she looked at his face, she was tired of maintaining emotional isolation as protection against potential professional complications. 18 months of civilian anonymity had taught her that safety without meaningful connection was just another form of imprisonment, and Antonio represented the first opportunity she had encountered to find both purpose and partnership with someone who might actually understand the world she came from. You're right, she admitted, abandoning her attempts to maintain professional distance in favor of honesty about feelings she had been trying to ignore. This is complicated, but it's also the first time since leaving military service that I've felt like someone understands what I'm capable of and appreciates what I'm willing to sacrifice for people who matter. That's exactly what I was hoping you would say, Antonio replied, reaching up to touch her cheek with the kind of gentleness that seemed impossible from someone whose profession required violence and intimidation. Because I've never found anyone who could match the demands of this life, and I stopped believing such a person existed until I watched you handle those men outside your apartment. The compliment about her tactical capabilities should have been professional recognition, but delivered with his hand against her skin while his eyes searched her face, it became something far more intimate than career appreciation. Lena realized that her physical attraction to Antonio had been building since their first careful conversation, and his obvious respect for her abilities had only intensified her interest in discovering what kind of partnership might develop between them. When he kissed her, it was with the same careful intensity he had brought to their business negotiations, testing her responses while making his own intentions unmistakably clear. Lena found herself responding with passion that had been building for weeks, ever since their first encounter at the embassy, when she had recognized him as someone who might actually understand the violent world she had tried so hard to leave behind. The kiss deepened as they acknowledged the attraction that had been complicating their professional relationship since their coffee shop meeting, and Lena felt 18 months of emotional isolation dissolving as she allowed herself to connect with someone who appreciated both her capabilities and her willingness to use them for worthwhile purposes. When they finally separated, both breathing harder than the physical contact warranted, Lena realized that she had crossed every line she had established to maintain professional boundaries. But instead of regret, she felt relief at finally acknowledging feelings that had been growing stronger despite her attempts to maintain appropriate distance. This changes things, she said, stating the obvious while trying to process the implications of becoming personally involved with someone whose business interests might require her to engage in activities that could destroy any hope of returning to civilian life. Only in ways that make everything better, Antonio replied, his voice carrying confidence that suggested he had been anticipating this development and preparing for its consequences. Tomorrow you'll protect my family as a professional, but tonight you're here as someone I care about, and I want you to understand that both roles matter equally to me. The distinction between professional and personal relationships was exactly what Lena needed to hear, and she realized that Antonio understood the complexity of mixing business with emotional involvement better than she had given him credit for. His ability to separate her value as security personnel from her worth as a partner suggested maturity and emotional intelligence that made him even more attractive than his obvious tactical competence. I should tell you something about why I left military service, she said, recognizing that complete honesty about her past was essential if their relationship was going to develop beyond physical attraction and professional respect. It might change how you think about trusting me with your family's safety. Nothing you could tell me would change my assessment of your capabilities or my confidence in your integrity, Antonio replied without hesitation. But I'm willing to listen to whatever you want to share, and I have some things about my own situation that you should understand before you commit to staying here. The mutual willingness to reveal vulnerabilities marked their transition from careful professional evaluation to genuine emotional intimacy, and Lena felt her heart rate increase as she prepared to share details about Syria that she had never discussed with anyone outside military psychological services. My last mission was in Syria, she began, settling beside Antonio on the couch that faced the windows overlooking his mother's garden. We were tasked with eliminating a chemical weapons facility that intelligence indicated was being used to produce materials for terrorist attacks against civilian targets in Europe. Antonio listened without interruption as she described the mission planning, the local contact who had provided targeting information, and the gradual realization that they were walking into a trap designed to eliminate American Special Operations personnel who had become too effective at disrupting enemy supply lines. 3 of my team members died in the explosion that was supposed to kill all of us, she continued, her voice steady despite the emotions that still surfaced whenever she relived those final moments in the collapsing building. I survived because my paranoia made me hang back when something felt wrong about the target location, but my caution wasn't enough to save Marcus, James, and Tyler. The survivor's guilt that had driven her to seek civilian anonymity was still painful to discuss, but sharing it with Antonio felt necessary and healing in ways that 18 months of therapy had not achieved. His obvious understanding of loss and responsibility made him someone who might actually comprehend the burden of making tactical decisions that determined who lived and who died. That wasn't your fault, Antonio said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who understood command responsibility and the impossible choices that came with leading people into dangerous situations. You did everything possible to protect your team, and their deaths were the result of enemy action, not your tactical decisions. The absolution should not have mattered coming from someone outside military command structure, but Antonio's obvious experience with life and death decisions gave his words weight that civilian therapeutic platitudes had never carried. More than that, his immediate understanding of her guilt suggested personal experience with similar losses. Thank you, she said, feeling something tight in her chest beginning to loosen for the first time since Syria. That means more coming from you than you might realize. I understand survivors' guilt better than you might expect, Antonio replied, his tone carrying the weight of personal experience with loss and responsibility. My father died in an attack that was meant for me, and I've spent the last 5 years trying to balance honoring his memory with protecting the rest of our family from the consequences of choices I made in response to his death. The revelation that Antonio's criminal involvement might have cost him his father reframed everything Lena thought she understood about his motivations and responsibilities. His devotion to family protection was not just personality trait, but active response to previous failure to keep someone safe who had mattered more than his own survival. It also explained his immediate understanding of her guilt about Syria and his confidence that shared experiences with loss might form the foundation for deeper emotional connection than either of them had expected to find with someone who understood the weight of decisions that affected other people's survival. We make quite a pair, she observed, Recognizing how their mutual experiences with loss and responsibility might create the kind of partnership that could survive the demands of Antonio's dangerous lifestyle. Two people who understand the cost of caring about others and the responsibility that comes with having capabilities most people can't imagine. Exactly what I was thinking, Antonio said, pulling her closer with movements that suggested both physical desire and emotional need for connection with someone who might actually understand the world he inhabited. Which brings me to something else you should know about our current situation. Lena felt him tense slightly as he prepared to share information that would obviously complicate their developing relationship, and she braced herself for revelations that might require her to make difficult decisions about continuing her involvement with his family and organization. My intelligence sources indicate that the Torino family has been investigating your background since yesterday's confrontation outside your apartment, he said, his voice carrying concern that seemed both professional and personal. They've identified you as former military and may be planning to use your service record against my organization in ways that could put you in serious danger. The news that rival criminals were investigating her classified military background sent cold dread through Lena's stomach as she realized that her worst fears about exposure might be materializing faster than she had imagined possible. If the Torino family possessed resources to access her SEAL service record, they might also be able to identify her former teammates, operational details, or classified mission information that could be used for blackmail or worse. More immediately troubling was the possibility that her involvement with Antonio had made her a target for people who understood how to exploit military veterans through threats against the people and principles they had sworn to protect. If the Torinos were sophisticated enough to research her background, they were probably also capable of developing leverage that would force her to choose between her own safety and Antonio's family protection. How much do they know? She asked, already calculating security implications and response options, while trying to process the emotional impact of realizing that her careful anonymity had been completely shattered. Enough to know your former SEAL Team 6 with classified operational experience, Antonio replied honestly. Not enough yet to access specific mission details or identify your former teammates, but they have contacts who might be able to provide that information given sufficient time and motivation. The admission that her worst fears were beginning to materialize should have made Lena reconsider her involvement with Antonio's organization, but instead she found herself angry at the violation of her privacy and determined to prevent the Torino family from using her military service against people she was beginning to care about. Then we need to make sure they don't get that time or motivation, she said, her voice carrying the tactical determination that had kept her alive through 6 years of special operations. What resources do you have for eliminating their intelligence-gathering capabilities? Antonio's smile in response to her aggressive approach to the problem confirmed that he had been hoping for exactly this reaction, and Lena realized that sharing their vulnerabilities had created the kind of partnership that might be stronger than either of them could have achieved independently. Everything we need to make them regret investigating people who know how to fight back, he said, his voice carrying satisfaction and anticipation. But first, I want to finish what we started before discussing business complications. When he kissed her this time, it was with the intensity of someone who had found exactly what he had been looking for and intended to claim it completely. Lena responded with matching passion while acknowledging to herself that her civilian life was not just over, but replaced by something potentially far more dangerous and infinitely more satisfying. As they moved together toward the bedroom, she realized that 18 months of emotional isolation had ended permanently, replaced by partnership with someone who understood both her capabilities and the sacrifices she was willing to make for people who mattered. Whether that partnership survived the coming confrontation with the Torino family remained to be determined, but for the first time since Syria, Lena was looking forward to finding out what happened next. The attack came at exactly 7:30 on Sunday evening, precisely when Antonio's family would normally be gathering for dessert after their traditional dinner. Lena had been monitoring the compound's surveillance system when the first vehicle appeared on the outer perimeter, followed by 2 more that positioned themselves to block all exit routes from the estate. Coordinated assault, multiple vehicles, professional spacing, she reported into her earpiece while activating the compound's defensive protocols. At least 12 attackers visible, probably more in reserve. They're moving to surround the main house. Antonio's response came immediately from the dining room, where he had been maintaining normal family interactions to avoid alarming his mother and elderly relatives. Copy that. Initiating lockdown procedures. How long do we have before they reach the house? Lena studied the monitors, showing black-clad figures advancing with military precision through the compound's carefully maintained gardens. Based on their movement patterns and coordination, these were not typical criminal enforcers, but trained operatives who understood tactical assault principles and had prepared extensively for this operation. 3 minutes maximum, she replied, already moving toward the weapons cache Antonio had positioned for exactly this scenario. They have night vision and suppression equipment. This is a professional hit, not intimidation. The distinction was crucial because it meant the attackers intended to eliminate rather than capture, and their level of preparation suggested they had intelligence about the compound's defensive capabilities and personnel. More troubling was their obvious confidence in overwhelming whatever resistance they expected to encounter. Lena reached the armory and selected weapons appropriate for close-quarters combat in a residential environment. Her years of SEAL training had included extensive practice in protecting civilian areas from hostile assault, but she had never expected to apply those skills while defending someone she cared about personally. The first explosions came from the compound's outer security barriers as the attackers eliminated electronic surveillance and communication equipment that might allow the defenders to coordinate with outside support. The systematic destruction confirmed that this was an elimination mission rather than robbery or intimidation, and that escape was not part of their tactical planning. They're cutting communications and preparing for final assault, Lena reported while moving toward the main house, where Antonio's family was now under direct threat. I'm implementing protection protocols for all civilians. Keep your family in the dining room and away from windows. Already done, Antonio replied, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who had been preparing for this confrontation for months. My mother is asking questions, but everyone is following instructions. What do you need from me? Trust me to handle the tactical response while you coordinate family safety, Lena said, reaching the main house as the first gunfire erupted from the compound's outer defenses. Stay with your family until I can neutralize the immediate threats. The sound of automatic weapons fire sent adrenaline flooding through Lena's system as she transitioned from protective security to active combat mode. Her 18 months of civilian life dissolved completely, replaced by the tactical mindset that had kept her alive through dozens of hostile encounters in environments far more dangerous than suburban New York. She positioned herself at the main house entrance and began systematically eliminating the attackers who had penetrated the compound's outer defenses. Her training with various weapon systems and extensive experience in urban combat gave her decisive advantages over enemies who had expected to overwhelm amateur criminal security rather than encounter professional military opposition. The first 3 attackers went down in rapid succession as they attempted to breach the main house entrance. Lena's precision shooting and tactical positioning allowed her to control the engagement while protecting the civilian areas where Antonio's family had taken shelter. Each shot was calculated to neutralize threats while avoiding collateral damage to the elegant home that represented decades of family history. But the attackers were more numerous and better coordinated than she had initially assessed. As she engaged the primary assault team, flanking elements began approaching the house from multiple directions, forcing her to adjust tactics and request support from the only person available who might possess relevant combat experience. Antonio, I need you to cover the south entrance, she called through her earpiece while reloading and preparing to engage the next wave of attackers. They're trying to flank us, and I can't maintain defense of all approaches simultaneously. On my way, Antonio replied without hesitation, and Lena heard the sound of him moving through the house toward the defensive position she had indicated. His willingness to leave family protection to join active combat confirmed her assessment of his tactical understanding and personal courage. When Antonio appeared beside her carrying a rifle that he obviously knew how to use, Lena felt a surge of confidence that had nothing to do with increased firepower and everything to do with fighting alongside someone who understood the stakes and possessed the skills to contribute meaningfully to their mutual survival. How many are left? He asked, positioning himself to cover approaches she could not observe while maintaining communication with family members who remained under shelter in the compound's safe areas. At least 6 confirmed, probably more in reserve, Lena replied while engaging targets who were attempting to advance under covering fire from their companions. They're better trained than your typical criminal muscle, but they're not prepared for coordinated resistance from people who actually know how to fight. Their tactical cooperation was seamless despite never having trained together, each anticipating the other's movements and providing support that maximized their collective effectiveness while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. Antonio's experience with violent confrontation combined with Lena's military training created defensive coordination that systematically dismantled the attacker's operational planning. The engagement lasted 17 minutes from first contact to final elimination of hostile forces, but the tactical superiority of experienced defenders fighting on familiar ground ultimately prevailed over numerical advantage and superior equipment. When the compound fell silent except for the sound of sirens approaching from multiple directions, Lena and Antonio had successfully protected his family while demonstrating capabilities that would prevent future attacks through sheer deterrent effect. "Are you hurt?" Antonio asked as they conducted final security sweeps to ensure no attackers remained concealed within the compound's extensive grounds. "Minor cuts and bruises. Nothing serious," Lena replied, checking his condition while processing the reality that they had just survived coordinated assault by professional killers. "More importantly, your family is completely safe, and our response should convince any other potential enemies that attacking this compound is more dangerous than profitable." The sound of approaching emergency vehicles indicated that their defensive actions had attracted law enforcement attention that would require careful management to avoid complications that might expose sensitive information about Antonio's business activities. But his connections within local government and law enforcement would probably ensure that the incident was investigated as attempted burglary rather than organized crime warfare. "My people will handle the official response," Antonio assured her while they moved toward the main house to check on family members who had remained under protection throughout the engagement. "What matters is that everyone I care about is alive and unharmed, including you." The possessive undertone in his voice when mentioning her safety sent warmth through Lena's chest despite the adrenaline still flooding her system from recent combat. Fighting beside him had confirmed her assessment that Antonio possessed both the tactical competence and personal courage that would make him worthy partner in any dangerous situation they might face together. When they entered the dining room where his family had sheltered during the attack, Lena was struck by the immediate acceptance she encountered from people who had just witnessed her defend their lives through lethal violence. Antonio's mother, a dignified woman in her 70s, approached her with obvious gratitude rather than fear or questions about her background. "Thank you," she said simply, embracing Lena with genuine warmth that suggested understanding of what had just been risked and sacrificed for their protection. "Antonio told us you were special, but I don't think any of us understood exactly how special until tonight." The grandmother's immediate acceptance was echoed by other family members who expressed gratitude and respect for Lena's tactical performance without demanding explanations about her background or qualifications. Their reaction suggested that Antonio's family understood the realities of his business activities while appreciating anyone willing to risk their life for family protection. "Mama," Antonio said, moving to stand beside Lena while addressing his mother with obvious affection and respect, "I want you to know that Lena will be staying permanently as head of our family security operations. More than that, she'll be staying as my partner in every aspect of our lives going forward." The formal announcement that their professional and personal relationships had become permanently intertwined was delivered with confidence that suggested Antonio had been planning this declaration regardless of the evening's violent events. But his timing, in front of family members who had just witnessed Lena's dedication to their protection, ensured that his choice would be accepted and celebrated rather than questioned. The family's response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive, with multiple relatives expressing delight that Antonio had finally found someone who could match both his dangerous lifestyle and his devotion to family welfare. Their acceptance of Lena as both security chief and future family member confirmed that her transition from isolated civilian to integrated criminal organization member was complete and irreversible. As the evening continued with law enforcement interviews and cleanup activities that would restore the compound to normal residential appearance, Lena found herself reflecting on how completely her life had changed since the embassy encounter that had exposed her military background. 18 months of civilian anonymity had been replaced by partnership with someone who not only appreciated her capabilities, but had provided her with purpose and belonging that military service had never achieved. 6 months later, Lena stood in the compound's training facility, instructing Antonio's security personnel in tactical methods that would ensure family protection remained effective against any future threats. Her seal tattoo was clearly visible as she demonstrated close-quarters combat techniques, no longer concealed but displayed with pride as symbol of her qualifications and commitment to the organization. The men she was training respected both her military background and her obvious authority within Antonio's operation, asking informed questions about urban combat and defensive planning that indicated genuine interest in professional development rather than grudging compliance with orders from outsider leadership. Antonio watched from the observation area with expression of complete satisfaction as his lethal fiancée transformed criminal muscle into tactical professionals capable of protecting everything he valued. Their engagement had been announced 3 months earlier, and wedding planning was proceeding despite the demanding schedule required by expanding their legitimate business operations while maintaining security against remaining criminal rivals. Did you love seeing Lena finally embrace her warrior side and find someone who truly appreciates her strength? Subscribe for more stories about hidden heroes finding their perfect match, and let me know in the comments what kind of military romance you want to see next. Their empire was being built on foundation of mutual respect, shared violence when necessary, and unconditional protection of family members who had become the center of both their personal and professional lives. The isolated database administrator and the lonely crime boss had found each other across a government waiting room, and their partnership had created something stronger and more dangerous than either could have achieved independently. The training facility had become symbol of their successful integration, where Lena's military expertise elevated Antonio's organization from traditional criminal muscle to professional security force capable of protecting legitimate business interests while maintaining readiness for any threats that might emerge from their previous life. Her tactical knowledge combined with his strategic understanding had created defensive capabilities that attracted clients seeking protection services rather than traditional criminal activities. As Lena returned her attention to training soldiers who would protect the people she had learned to love, she realized that civilian anonymity had been poor substitute for the sense of belonging and purpose she had discovered by accepting her true nature and finding someone worthy of sharing it with. The violence might continue and the dangers would certainly persist, but she would never again have to face either challenge alone. More importantly, her survivor's guilt about Syria had finally begun to fade as she found ways to honor her fallen teammates by using her training to protect people who mattered to her personally. Marcus, James, and Tyler would have understood her choice to embrace partnership with someone who appreciated both her capabilities and her willingness to sacrifice everything for family protection. Antonio approached as the training session concluded, wrapping his arms around the woman who had transformed his organization's capabilities while claiming his heart completely. "You know," he said, his voice carrying satisfaction and anticipation for their shared future, "I think we make an excellent team." "The best kind of team," Lena replied, leaning back against the chest of the man who had recognized her value and provided her with everything she had been seeking since leaving military service behind. Partners in every way that matters. Their engagement ring caught the light as she gestured toward the soldiers who were implementing tactical procedures she had designed specifically for family protection operations. The 3-carat diamond was beautiful, but more meaningful was the inscription inside the band that read, "Partners in everything," acknowledging that their bond encompassed professional respect, personal devotion, and shared commitment to protecting the people they loved. Their wedding was scheduled for the following spring in the garden where Antonio's mother grew the herbs she used for traditional family recipes, surrounded by relatives who had embraced Lena as the daughter-in-law who could keep their beloved son safe while ensuring family traditions continued despite ongoing security concerns. The ceremony would blend Italian customs with military honors, reflecting the cultural backgrounds that had shaped both their lives. The guest list included active and retired SEAL team members who had served with Lena, creating unique social dynamic between elite military operators and reformed criminal organization members who shared mutual respect for professional competence and dedication to protecting innocent people. The unlikely combination had already resulted in consulting opportunities that allowed both communities to benefit from shared tactical knowledge. But beyond the wedding planning and business expansion, what mattered most to both of them was the certainty that they had found partnership worthy of the sacrifices they had made to protect others throughout their respective careers. Neither had expected to find someone who understood the weight of life-and-death decisions or appreciated the burden of possessing capabilities that most people could never comprehend. Looking at the compound that had become their shared home and the organization that had become their mutual purpose, Lena understood that everything she had lost in Syria had led her to this moment of complete belonging with someone who matched her strength while challenging her to become even more than she had believed possible. The quiet SEAL and the devoted crime boss had found their perfect match in each other, and their combined capabilities would ensure that anyone threatening their family would learn exactly what happened when predators decided to become protectors instead. Their love story had begun with mutual recognition across a government waiting room, but their partnership would last forever because they had chosen to claim each other completely, accepting both the dangers and rewards of building a life together on foundation of shared violence transformed into unconditional protection.